the brief prayer.
Uh, the prayers of our holy fathers, O Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us. O heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasure of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us, and cleanse us of all impurity, and save our souls, O good one. Through the prayers of our holy Father, Abba Dorotheus of Gaza, have mercy on us and save us and illumine us this evening. Amen. Well, thanks everyone for showing up. I guess you're having some weather there, so maybe this is the real dedicated crowd before me. In any event, I will do my very best not to go too long this evening, with you guys having to travel home in mind. So feel free to just stop the broadcast in the middle of it if it goes too long. So as I was saying when we were sort of off the air, but for those of you at home, you can find this text, I guess, on as they were telling me, on the Apostle Paul bookstore on their website. We're looking at Abba Dorotheus, Practical Teachings on the Christian Life, and this evening we're going to begin with On the Conscience, which is lesson 3, and if we have a chance, we'll move to lesson 4 as well, the On the Fear of God. And so, basically, briefly, to sort of, not to recap per se, but, Abba Dorotheus, we sort of talked about this text. He was a monk in the 6th century in the desert in Gaza, but I think this is a very excellent text because it was him speaking to his disciples, to sort of young novices, you might say, at a monastery, the monks in general. But he sort of presents the basics of the Christian life. And so in that sense, I think this is a text that we can, that if we read it with discernment, that we can get a lot of benefit from it. As I cautioned the other week, some of the examples are particularly monastic. That doesn't mean that we should just throw them away. It just means that we have to apply them to the situation of our own lives and try to figure out what the principle is, so that we can kind of do that. I think there's some actually that come up this evening, which will be sort of interesting examples, and we can talk about ways in which we can kind of see the principle in it, so that it applies directly to us, even if we don't live in the kind of the particular monastic context that Abba Dorotheus and his fathers were living in at the time. So last week we started with lesson 2 on humility. The reason why we've skipped lesson 1, eventually I think we'll get back to it. It's a rather long one to begin with, and a major sort of point of that is setting up to talk about humility. So it's almost natural to begin with humility anyway, and sort of to proceed from there. And so this is what we're doing tonight. So we saw with humility a bit, and now we're going to look at this sort of an extension of this in many ways, really, which is On the Conscience. So, for those who haven't read it and who don't have a copy of it, I'm just going to read some passages to begin with from this that kind of synopsizes it, and then we can kind of open it up a little bit to see if people want to ask questions, things that sort of stood out to them. What I'm really hoping for from this, sort of again as a general introduction, when you read, I want you to find the things that that challenge you, or that you really enjoyed, that were really inspiring, or that you were very skeptical about, or things that you would wonder, how could this really apply to us today? Because I think it's only in this kind of honest approaching of the Holy Fathers to ask these kinds of questions that we can kind of begin to enter into their spirit and begin to acquire the mind of the Fathers that we talk about, or the mind of the Church. If we don't wrestle with these things, if we just sort of push them aside because we don't like them, or because they don't seem to fit with the way we sort of view the world, we're really missing out, because it's a big mistake to think that, oh, these people just don't apply in our day, or don't speak to my time, and so I just ignore this or that teaching, as opposed to really kind of wrestling with it and seeing, well, okay, how can we understand this? How can this have meaning for us, and what does it mean, for me? And so I would encourage you to always do that with your readings and be thinking of that. So you can think of even that context as I read some of these passages this evening. So we're just going to begin with the first page, paragraph 40, where he begins, and he says, "When God created man, he sowed something divine within him, a certain kind of reason, warm and bright, illuminating his nous, and showing him how to distinguish between good and evil. This is called conscience. It is the natural law. It is the wells dug by Jacob, as our fathers said, and which the Philistines filled with earth." We read this in Genesis 26:15. "The patriarchs and all the saints followed the law, that is the law of conscience, before the written law was given, and they were pleasing to God. However, since natural law was buried in the ground and trampled upon by men through the advance of sin, we needed the written law, the holy prophets, and the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. All this in order to rediscover and rebuild it. That is, ignite that spark which was under the soil by keeping his holy commandments." So the nice thing about Abderothius is, and you'll notice this as you see the different lessons, is he really seems to kind of set out what we're about in the very first paragraph. And he's generally speaking quite direct about it. And so again, we see that in this particular example. He says that the conscience is something that God has placed within us, warm and bright, a kind of reason that illumines our nous. Illumines, we might say, our deep heart, our spiritual heart, from where we encounter God, and shows us deep within ourselves how we can distinguish between good and evil if we pay attention to this conscience that God has put in us. And he uses this sort of scriptural quote of Jacob and Jacob's well, which we read later on in the New Testament with the Samaritan woman meeting our Lord at Jacob's well. But the Philistines, the non-Jews who filled this with earth, and he goes on to give this allegorical interpretation, basically, of the sort of deeper meaning of what's going on here. You'll notice he does this in a few different places, and it doesn't mean that the literal meaning isn't also there. It just means that he's taking it a step deeper and kind of pointing out these other aspects that are there. And so he says this conscience, this natural law that's in us, is something that basically has been trampled down and that has been buried, and that each one of us do this. He's referring specifically to sort of a historical period before Christ, who comes to give us the power to kind of to dig it out again, as it were, through the following of his holy commandments. But this isn't just a back then situation. This is the situation that we're all in every day right now. And so I'm just going to continue with the second paragraph, because he kind of elaborates a little bit on the first. He says, "It is up to us now," and this is why I say it's not just about then, it's about now. "It is up to us now either to bury our conscience under the ground or to have it shine forth and illuminate us if we obey it. When our conscience," and so he goes to kind of say, well, what do we mean by this? Well, when our conscience says to us, "Do this," and we treat it with contempt, that is, we ignore it, or it says it again and we refuse, then we are trampling it down and burying it underground. Thus, it cannot speak to us clearly because of the weight upon it, but like a lamp that only sheds a dim light, so the conscience gradually starts to show things more darkly and more obscurely. This is so important. So important. A lot of people question whether or not there is such a thing as a conscience or a moral law. Maybe is one that we would more criticize in contemporary society. The suggestion that certain actions are right or wrong, and that we know them naturally and sort of inherently within ourselves. And if we look at this reading of Abderothius, he would very clearly say, I think, based on this, that the reason why people would question the existence of this is precisely because they've buried it so deeply, that they've, stop paying attention to their conscience for so long that they're not even aware that it's there. And that not only that, but it's, as he says, it's only shedding a dim light, so that it's actually obscuring the way that they view the world. And by they, I should say we, because this is the situation all of us find ourselves in, and this is why he begins with, Abbot Dorotheus says, our. He's speaking about us. He's speaking to us. But I think in our particular sort of context, in our modern context, this is particularly applicable. And we have to ask ourselves, if we too sort of fall into questioning, whether something is good or bad, and we feel like, well, maybe we can't know these things. The first thing we ought to do is say, am I thinking like this because I haven't been paying attention to my conscience? Because I haven't been being careful, to the teachings of Christ, the following of the keeping of His holy commandments, as he says, which are the means to clean off the sort of, let's say he uses the image of a light. Well, imagine our soul is like a lantern, and when we follow the commandments of Christ, it's like shining the outward part of the glass so that the light can sort of shine through brightly. And so this is kind of what he's setting up for us in these very first two paragraphs. Now I'm just going to keep going through and read a few more of them, so we sort of have a sense of the overall sort of flow of the whole thing, and then I want us to come back maybe with some of your own sort of thoughts and questions. And so if we could just turn to the next page, number 42, and I'll read a little. Brethren, let us therefore, in light of what we've just said, let us therefore try to guard our conscience while we are in the world, without provoking it to censure us about anything, without trampling upon it in any way, even over something insignificant, since you know that from those small things we also come to despise the great ones. When somebody begins to say, what does it matter if I say that word? What does it matter if I eat that little thing? What does it matter if I pay attention to that? From the what does it matter for this and what does it matter for that, one obtains the bad and malignant sore and starts to despise and trample upon one's own conscience in great and important matters. Thus, progressively, one is in danger of falling into total insensibility. And this is what I was sort of mentioning from the previous paragraph or the previous page, was this insensibility that seems to sort of, like a cloud, fallen upon all of, or many of us in our modern culture, so that we've lost all sense of what is right and wrong, and we feel embarrassed to suggest that that we should have some sense of this, and that these things can be clear, and he's pointing to the cause. So if we've ever wondered why, he's giving us the answer. He's largely saying it's because human beings have stopped paying attention to it, and trampled upon it. And he goes on, and this is very important, I think, for us within the Orthodox Church, because we often talk about the church as a hospital. And so the next part is very sort of germane to that. Therefore, brethren, be careful not to neglect the small things. Take care not to despise them as something insignificant. They are not insignificant. They are cancer for the soul, a bad habit. Let us therefore be vigilant. Let us pay attention to slight things whilst they are still slight and before they become serious, right? No one would say, well, that's just a little cancer cell growing in there, right? No big deal. It's just small. I'll wait till it's a tumor and then I'll go deal with it. I mean, we could choose to do that, but the people around us might kind of, shake their head a little bit. So this is sort of what he's pointing out. When we say, and when we act in our lives, and we say about these small things, oh, it doesn't really matter. Yeah, it's a fast period. Yeah, we just started the nativity fast, but I like to start it a little bit later because it's my birthday, or because so-and-so is having, a get-together. Like the way in which we kind of, it doesn't really matter if I skip my prayers today because, I'm really busy. And his point is to say, It's from these little things that we gradually get to the greater things. And so he says this right here. And I mean, in the very next line, which is sort of, on the one hand, it tells us to take everything serious, but on the other hand, it also goes to show how easy the Christian life actually is, how easy the life of holiness can actually be, because it's in the small things. He says, both the life of holiness and the sinful life start from the little things and lead to the greater ones. God does not expect you and I to be a saint right now, perfect from this moment forward. He understands us and the condition that we're in. All he asks is for us to do the little things that he gives to us throughout the day to do. And that through continually doing these little things, we'll arrive at the greater ones without even realizing how we got there. But on the same token, this is exactly what happens in the spiritual life with respect to sin and with respect to evil. It's precisely by not paying attention to the little things, to our conscience, and saying, oh, what does that little thing matter? What does it matter if I say this little thing? What does it matter if I eat this little thing? What does it matter if I do that? That without realizing it, before we know it, we're down the road committing these great sins. You know, a person doesn't begin with murder. All right? It doesn't usually, it doesn't work that way, generally speaking. Okay? There probably are some instances. But generally speaking, it doesn't work that way. Where does it begin with? It begins with irritation, which builds to agitation, which builds to anger, which builds to outbursts of anger. And we can kind of see, if we were looking back, on the spectrum of a person's life, it didn't start, the first thing they ever did was go out and kill someone, right? There's a whole ladder of progression that happens before we get to that really terrible stage. And so we need to be conscious. We need, as much as possible, to wrestle even with the little things. Yes, in the moment, the little thing might not matter that much. But we don't know that this one little thing isn't going to begin this sort of process whereby we've ended at this sort of latter stage, which either makes us a saint or makes us a demon. Not literally a demon, but you understand what I mean, right? And so this is what's so important about what Abba Dorotheus is sort of presenting for us here. And he's saying God has built this into us. If we follow the commandments and we sort of keep our soul clean in that sense, we'll be able to sort of follow this path. Let's continue to go on. Number 43. Abba Dorotheus says, well, he told us we have to guard our conscience. Well, he's going to tell us the guarding of the conscience takes on many forms. And he says everybody should act according to his conscience in three ways. He says towards God, towards his neighbor, and towards material things. These are the three areas, okay? If you leave here tonight, this is what you need to think. Okay, I need to guard my conscience. Well, I need to guard it with regard to three things. With regard to God, with regard to my neighbor, and with regard to material things. And the rest of this, chapter basically is just a paragraph on each of those, a little bit more. So in the case of guarding our conscience with respect to God, he points out a little bit further down, he says, in short, we should also keep our conscience vigilant in secret actions that nobody witnesses but for God and our conscience. This is what he means when he talks about before God. Yes, the big outward things, right? Don't blaspheme. Don't ridicule people, who go to the church. Don't speak badly about clergy. All of these sort of kinds of things that you might say are more directly related to God. But what he's saying more to the point is all of this kind of secret stuff that only you see and God sees. Right? Because God sees the heart. He sees every action, everything we do and everything we will do, he's aware of. Right? We're always doing things in his presence. We can hide from other people and pretend, that we're this or that or the other thing. But we can't pretend to God because he's always there. He sees everything. And so guarding our conscience with respect to God is being careful in these ways that it has nothing to do with other people. Right? It's just me and God. Whether I do my prayers, for example, or, as we said, how we keep our fast, or the kinds of thoughts we have, especially, right? Those are between us and God. And this is what he means, guarding our conscience with respect to those things. The things that God sees, but that no one else sees. So that's the first thing. The first way we can guard our conscience. The second way, he says in number 44, the guarding of the conscience with regard to one's neighbor, which is doing absolutely nothing at all that we know will upset or wound him, either by deed, word, gesture, or even a glance. And what we see here is just how far he's suggesting we try to go with not working up our neighbor, as it were, right? Because sometimes we say, well, I didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. Yeah, but you rolled your eyes, right? Like, it was pretty obvious when you went, oh, sure, he didn't say anything. These are the kinds of things that he's kind of pointing out in this particular instance, right? The ways in which, even if we're not sort of happy with what's going on, we try not to upset our neighbor, right? And especially things that we sort of actively do. That kind of, when we're not considerate of other people. We're not considerate of how they feel. When we put ourselves first and our desires above theirs. Right? And we see this in our families. It would be really nice. Your mother wants you to visit, or maybe you live at home and, she could really use a hand with the dishes or something like that. And yet we say, oh, I'm busy, I got to be somewhere. And we don't think about it. Right? And we don't think about the effect that this can have on the people around us, on our neighbor. He says, briefly, man infects his conscience by deliberately doing those things that he knows will provoke his neighbor and will harm him, and this is one I think is particularly useful, and embarrass him. We have to be very careful, especially with family members, especially with people that are close to us, not to do things that will belittle them out of our anger, that will embarrass them, especially in front of other people, but also in private. This is something that, because usually I think it happens with people that are closest to us. Sure, we can be tempted maybe to ridicule our neighbor or our enemy, we might say, someone that we don't like at work here or there, especially to other people, not necessarily to them, which is also what he's talking about here. But I think we need to also look closer to home. The way in which we do harm to the people that are around us all the time. The people who are the closest to us, because they're often the people easiest to hurt, because we know them so well, and who we take for granted the most. So this is what he's referring to there. And then the final one he's saying about paying attention and acting guarding our conscience, rather, according to material things, or immaterial things. And this is all paragraph 45. And he sort of gives these very interesting, one might say very monastic examples. I know in talking to other people about this, these are some of the things that they kind of pulled out. But these are great examples, as I said, where we can say, okay, what's the principle here? Because probably most of us, go more than 2 weeks before we wash the pair of clothing that we're wearing. In the sense that they're wearing repeatedly the same clothing for, weeks on end before they wash them. And the complaint here is that by this sort of excessive washing, when you could have waited however many weeks, you did it sooner, and it wore the clothing out. These are things I think that, generally speaking, aren't on most of our radars, right? He gives a bunch of different examples like this. The mattress, right? We want the comfy mattress instead of the lumpy one with hay. These are the kinds of things that we can be tempted, I think, to say, well, how does this really apply, right? But the principle is the same. And what he's talking about, if we sort of think about it, is asking ourselves, how often are we wasteful with material things? How often are we wasteful with food, with money, with our time, with anything? And that we say, what does it matter about this little thing? Or what does it matter if I do this, right? If we sort of keep that in mind, that kind of attitude, we can see, I think, unfortunately, that we have this towards material things a lot of the time, right? This is the whole idea of killing time. Well, I have time to kill, as though we have so much extra time that, this is the kind of leftover stuff that we can do whatever we want with. Same with the money. We say, well, this is my extra money. I can do whatever I want with it. Well, if all of our life is God's, is thine own of thine own, as we say, right? And we offer back to him. There's no extra, right? The fathers of the church teach, for example, any extra money that we have actually belongs to the poor and not to us at all. And so that when we waste money, for example, we're actually stealing from the poor because it's their money, not ours. God has given it to us to be good stewards, to use in a way to build up the church and to build up the community and build up the people around us, right? This is a difficult teaching for us. It doesn't, again, we need to apply these things with discernment, and we can think and talk about what that might look like. But the principle is the same, right? We need to be constantly asking ourselves and paying attention to our conscience and saying, am I being wasteful here? Do I really need this or don't I? Is this okay? And listen to what our conscience says and get into the habit of saying, if your conscience is saying, no, it's not okay, then say, okay, I won't do it. Even if I'm not sure why, even if whatever, I just won't do it in this instance. And the more we do this and the more we pay attention to our conscience, the easier this becomes, the more natural it becomes, so that we don't even get into the struggle in the first place. That's kind of what he's hinting at here. And then he adds, which is a very wonderful thing, again, about our faith. He says a monk, or we could say a Christian, and number 46, should not allow his conscience to make him remorseful, upset about anything. Right? And that this is what we're trying to do. This is what we're sort of called to do, is to have our conscience clear before God and before our neighbor. Right? That we don't have this hanging over us. But he says that, what does he say? Therefore, brethren, we must be always vigilant and keep ourselves free from all this so as not to fall into danger. That's the sort of the first and the best way in which to do this. As he says, our Lord has sort of testified to it. But what we see, and I've sort of noted it here, it's in the beginning of this whole volume. There's a life of a disciple of Dorotheus called Dositheus. He's a young monk. And what we see with him is, how is it then that we deal with if we make our conscience sorrowful? And what we see in the case of him is him running to Dorotheus and confessing the sorrow, confessing these sins, confessing these ways in which he feels burdened by what he's done or by his conscience. The church has given us this, Christ has given this to the church, I should say, precisely to relieve this burden from us. That even if we've transgressed these things, even if we're not where we want to be, because everything is in the small things, and we win some battles and we lose some battles every day, every moment of every day, right? But that within all of that, we have this way to sort of relieve that, which is holy confession. And if we use it and we're paying attention to our conscience, and we open ourselves up in confession, we can see just how easy this to keep our souls clean and to keep our conscience polished, we might say, how easy it becomes. So this is all, I said even a little bit more than I sort of had intended to, but about Dorotheus. But does anyone have any questions about this? Anything that sort of, I don't know how many people got a chance to get to the text, but things from the text that stood out to you, or in this stuff that maybe challenged you, that you thought was, particularly good or particularly unrealistic even. I mean, I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts, because I think in terms of you guys thinking this through and working through this is where the most fruit can be had in terms of us acquiring it.
Eloyete Father, my name is Irene. I particularly was interested about the section where if you see like something that is wasted or something, it needs to be put back in its place.
Mm.
So does that refer to, like, say for instance, like garbage on the street, like we should go out of our way to pick it up and put it in its place to beautify the place, the earth that God gave us? What are your thoughts on that? And I actually have another question after that.
Sure. My thought is, yeah, that's exactly what he has in mind. I think the interesting thing that with this sort of Avidarotheus, and just in general, is that we can say um, that everyone can, but not everyone must, if that sort of makes sense. So what I mean by that is we need to take this principle and we need to apply it in the circumstances in our life. But how that's going to look in everyone's individual life, in their circumstances, could be quite different, right? And so I think it does extend even to the call of, yeah, maybe, taking a Saturday and going with a garbage bag, in the park and just picking up garbage. I mean, this is a work that we can offer, to God and to our community, to serve our neighbor, the beautifying of things. This is one way to do it. It's not necessarily the only way to do it. But again, part of figuring out, is this something I'm being called to do or not, is paying attention to the conscience. And the more we do that and the more sensitive we get to it, we can get to the point to say, oh, this is something I would like to do, but I really can't do it. And this is something that I really need to make time to do because I feel like, maybe God is calling me through my conscience to actually do it. And so I think that's sort of the interesting thing with this, is that it's not just either or. It's within our strength, it's within our circumstances, and it's within our own conscience what God is sort of calling us to. But I think that is definitely part of the reading, definitely from the text. How far one applies it or how far that goes, whether that's just sort of picking up garbage in your own yard, or whether it means, like I said, taking time to do it more intentionally, well, a person needs to kind of discern that.
Father?
Bob, just asking that part, I think before you asked your question, it's funny because I was on my work today and I had some garbage I was trying to pick up before I would be late for work. What I want to ask you about is with that, of course, with all things discretion, right? Like Irene's mentioned something that's very valid. It may sound silly to some of us, but actually I had some garbage, like I said today, that I couldn't pick up because I was on my way to work, right? What about happens if we're not careful with these things, that we develop a guilty conscience about everything, Like, for example, I'm getting off the subway, I'm walking, I see a homeless person. I don't have any money. I feel horribly bad inside. I wish I had something to give them, or whatever it may be. What about the point where we go to the other extreme, where we develop a very guilty conscience about everything, and we get nothing done because our conscience is bothering us too much, quote unquote?
Yeah, well, we can look to Avidarotheus, right, where he says in number 46, our fathers say that the monk, or in this case the Christian, should not allow his conscience to make him remorseful about anything. Well, the solution to that, if you're feeling this remorse and you're not sure, is it overly burdened by guilt? Is it something I shouldn't feel guilty about? How do I deal with that? Well, the answer is you go to your spiritual father, you go to confession, and you say, I'm struggling with this. And the more we do that, and the more that we allow the grace of the priesthood, to be there to inform and illumine us in these things, after a certain amount of time, we're going to be able to figure out what the balance is. Because one, our conscience is going to become clearer for us, and two, we have the grace of God there, sort of helping us, and even just the practical advice of the priest, that's sort of allowing us to eventually kind of get that balance. The reality is, I'd rather feel overburdened by guilt in many situations than be insensitive, as he points out, is generally the case with what happens with the conscience. Oversensitivity is a problem, but better that than to forget you even have a conscience and not even be aware of it. And so again, we run to the spiritual father as the means to sort of unburden the conscience and to kind of tweak it with guidance. And so that would be my suggestion, anyway.
Very good, Papa. Thank you. Sorry, Irene, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I have another question. My understanding is that I could be wrong, but every Orthodox Christian has a guardian angel. And I'm interested in your thoughts about the role of the guardian angel in relation to the consciousness, and how we can use that gift from God to help us in our everyday life to try to lead that, God-fearing, like, conscious existence.
Yeah, is an excellent point, which I think, we don't necessarily spend enough time, or certainly I don't spend enough time thinking about. It's a nice feature of, especially of some of the Russian prayer books that I've seen, that they have, regular sort of prayer services to the guardian angel, supplications like a paraklesis to the guardian angel, and I've even seen some akathis and things like that. And so, um, but as the fathers teach, our guardian angel is given to us, in our baptism, there to be with us always, us individually, and to help us in this process of guarding our conscience. Because what they do is, in the same way that one of the inspirations for sinful thoughts comes from the demons, in the same way, an inspiration of good thoughts comes from the angels, and particularly our guardian angel, who is there sort of, I mean, we use the sort of caricatures of the two things on the shoulder. Well, there's a little bit of truth in that if we don't use it so ridiculously, but in the sense that your guardian angel is there helping to encourage you, to inspire good thoughts in you as much as possible. And so the easiest, in the same way that we say don't pay attention to the bad thoughts, because it's, the more attention we kind of give to them, the more likely we are to give in to them. Well, if we take that principle and apply it to these good thoughts that our guardian angel is giving, we would say the opposite. If we need to avoid paying attention to these bad thoughts from the demons, how much more ought we to be paying attention as actively as possible to the good thoughts that our guardian angel there is trying to inspire in us and in general. And so in that sense, I think this is great. This would be a great activity for people, even in your prayer world or even throughout your day, to think to say a prayer to your guardian angel, to be with you, to preserve you, to illumine you, for all of us. And as much as possible, try to remember them throughout the day, especially when we feel lonely or in temptation. Maybe this can also help to guard us from sin, right? Because not only is God watching us, but, it seems that we can kind of still find our way to committing sins. But think, my guardian angel's right here watching me. Only me, because that's who my guardian angel watches. He's in my presence. This friend who's so close to me, who loves me, who's nurtured me. And maybe that can also help us to preserve our conscience, even from the human thing of not wanting to feel ashamed of doing something when our guardian angel is there present with us. These are some sort of ways, but the main way is think about your guardian angel. Remember that you have one. Pray to them. And this will be a way to kind of cultivate that, I think. I don't know if that kind of, is there anything else you want to ask with respect to that, or?
Maybe. I've heard that, and I just heard this, and maybe you can verify it if you know, but I've heard that, like, for instance, when I was younger, I would go to nightclubs, and I heard that once you walk into a nightclub, the guardian angel does not come in with you, stays outside.
Yeah, I suppose. The thing is, yeah, we can distance our guardian angel, ourselves from our guardian angel, in the same way that we can say, God who is everywhere present and fills all things, and yet we talk about being distant from Him, driving away the Holy Spirit, driving grace away. Well, angels aren't bound by space and they're not bound by time, and so yeah, they're not in there with us, but I mean it's more the notion that this notion that they're not going to be there with us in sin, and that it creates a wedge. But in some ways, yes, in some ways it's helpful to think of it in this sort of physical way, and in the lives of the saints we kind of have seen that in certain instances. But another way that's helpful to think about this distance is the kind of distance that's created between friends. When you do something to hurt a good friend of yours, we talk about that also as being a distance, right? And it's something that we need to kind of overcome so that we're close again and together again. And we use all of this language, even though we don't really mean physically a physical distance. And so I guess I would just I wouldn't disagree with sort of what you said, but I would say your angel doesn't suddenly not know what you're doing. You can't hide behind a wall and your angel not know what you're doing. At least as I understand it, so in the tradition on it.
Okay, thank you, Father.
Okay. Does anyone have any other things that sort of stood out or that they might want to kind of discuss in this one?
Hello, hi. I just have a question. What about the thoughts that are good and bad at the same time, where it could be a good thing, but or it could also be a bad thing?
Yes.
I'm wondering,
A
what do you
lot
do
of
with
that,
them?
yeah, a lot of that has to do with discerning context. So,
Okay,
for example, it's a good thought, but it's during your prayers. Boom, get rid of it. It's not a good thought.
okay,
Good thoughts
okay,
don't come during your prayer. It might be a good thought, but it's not from your guardian angel. Let's say that. Okay.
okay.
Um, Context is a real big part of it, but also paying attention to the conscience. I mean, this is sort of the problem, right? Um, but the more we practice paying attention to our conscience in obvious ways, the easier it's going to be to understand it in the situations where it's not obvious, these
Okay.
difficult ones.
Okay,
And
thank you.
the best way on top of that, I'll just add the one other thing is there are certain thoughts that we really just don't know. Those are the thoughts that we need to take to a spiritual father in particular, especially if they're thoughts that are persisting, or they're thoughts that are really particularly important. You know, big decisions even, or things like that. These are the kinds of things, if there's like a lot of confusion there, we want to take them and put them to the judgment of our spiritual father. We always want to do this as much as possible, you know, to sort of consult on certain things, because even things we take to be 100% good, as we've seen from the tradition of the church, you know, can be from the devil.
Yeah.
And so that kind of discernment. But again, the more we get used to sort of polishing our conscience through the following of the commandments and through paying attention to it and staying close to our confessor and our spiritual father, the easier it becomes.
Okay, thank you.
Certainly. Okay. We can go on to the next one maybe, because I already see we're getting up there on time. Well, I don't know. It depends on you guys. Do you want to keep going for much longer? I think we've been at it now, what, 40 minutes or so?
Yeah, Father Matthew, actually, I had a quick question, if I could.
Certainly.
I'm trying to be quiet, but it's difficult for me. You know, I'll go back to that section of Avatharothos where he's talking about, just at the bottom of 44,
Yeah.
where man affects his conscience by deliberately doing those things that he knows will provoke his neighbor, right?
Yep.
Well, oftentimes I find that we're in situations where we don't even realize that we're doing that,
Mm.
right? So we're already at the stage where our conscience has already been numbed, if not covered up. I don't want to say completely, but the majority of the conscience has been covered up. You know, and especially with speaking with one another, right? If we raise a certain issue, let's say, you know, Peter's upset because I didn't carry his laptop computer when he hurt his leg, right? And I should have known that, right? But I was in La La Land at that moment. So can you speak to that? Because I think a lot of times with our biggest problems that we have as people, if not just Orthodox Christians, is that we are very we're not conscientious about how we treat one another. I think we're totally clueless about how we impact one another. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. What I'd have to say here is sort of like with the other things. And it really does come back to Abba Dorotheus' point of both the life of holiness and the sinful life start from the little things and lead to the greater ones, either good or bad. And what happens a lot of the times is, you know, Nikos, you're pointing out here, is that we've spent so much time not being attentive to our neighbor that we've actually developed we might say, a big problem. Well, the only way to sort of undo that, as it were, is to begin just as he says, the way we do everything in the spiritual life, which is start small and try slowly through the small steps to kind of become aware. So what does that mean? Sure, I seem to get in trouble with people a lot, and I'm not understanding why my relationships aren't really working out that well, okay? And maybe this isn't something you can fix right away because you've cultivated a way of thinking. But there are certain circumstances with respect to my neighbor that I know what the right thing is to do and what the wrong thing is to do. And in those cases which are very clear, we should be practicing, as it were, not provoking our neighbor or putting our neighbor first. And through the sort of practicing in the things that are easier, or in situations, I might say, where it's easy to put someone before yourself or not to provoke them. For example, maybe if it's about a serious financial matter in your relationship, there's going to be an explosion. Like it happens every single time, right? And while ideally we would say, you don't want that to happen, and sure, your spiritual father is going to give you a lot of practical advice of how to avoid those situations, you're still in this state where it's sort of a passion. It's a big problem, right? Fine. But there's other situations where we decide we're going to nitpick, even though we know that it's not a big pathos for us. We just need to be quiet. Like this one time, I'm not going to say something, and I'm going to let that person go first, even though it bothers me, even though I believe that I'm right and they're wrong, or something like that. I'm still going to do it. Or this person wants this for dinner. Yeah, okay, we had that for dinner 5 times. So what? Here's an opportunity. And if we sort of look for these ones that are a little bit easier, when we get into these situations that are hard, it becomes easier to do. And part of the thing is, the reason why we do this is because by doing it, how can I put this? Everyone has blind spots. All right, we all have these blind spots. We don't know what they are because there are blind spots. Other people probably do know, and they might be willing to tell you, even though a lot of times they won't, because we are not ready to receive them, right? But knowing that everyone has a blind spot, and we see them in people all around, how can we not have blind spots that we don't see in ourselves? Okay? So we should be saying to ourselves, clearly, if everyone seems to have blind spots about something, there's something in me that I have a blind spot about too, right? And so the way that we can kind of help to ensure that God is going to illumine us about those blind spots is by, in all of these opportunities where we can submit ourselves by paying attention to our conscience, that we should. And the more we practice that, we can also sort of have confidence that if there are things, and I don't know, am I transgressing my neighbor and not guarding my conscience with respect to my neighbor? I don't know that for sure. Maybe that's my blind spot, say. Well, at least if I practice it in these things, I can trust that eventually God will make it clear to me about those bigger things. These are all kinds of ways, and these are things that we can sort of offer to God in our prayers. Ignorance is a difficult one, right? How do we become conscious? Well, there's no easy way, right? Other than saying by practicing in the small things, we can trust that we'll become more sensitive. But there's no sort of kind of straightforward answer for how to fix the problem. The other side to this, especially when we're talking between Orthodox Christians and we're all meant to sort of be together and to struggle, is remember, while yes, we do need to put the emphasis on us, right? To have, where it says to guard your conscience, not provoking your neighbor and harming them and embarrassing them. At the same time, we have to remember that when someone provokes us, we're called not to be like, well, you provoked me and you went against your conscience, and didn't you read Abbot Dorotheus and Father Matthew was there and he was saying all this stuff, and look at you. Right? We're also called on the other side of things to not become provoked. Like the whole thing. So there's different sides to all of these things, and if all of us do what we can do, as much as is within our control, and we follow the things that we're kind of given in terms of paying attention, practice, go to the spiritual father, the idea is eventually these things will just start to resolve themselves.
Yeah, but you hit on the second point, which was my question. My other question was, it says we're not to provoke others, right? So oftentimes a lot of times between our interpersonal relationships is because, well, I didn't do anything, they provoked me, right?
Exactly.
How to deal with that on our conscience, right? And then what happens there? So we have the one extreme about the guilty conscience, but then we have the other extreme about the sly conscience. It's everyone else is being suspicious or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
So I think what you're trying to say is that regardless if we're the one that's provoking or we should be conscientious not to provoke, On the flip side, the same thing applies that if others are provoking us, then we should be guarding our conscience towards sin in either circumstance.
Yeah, with respect to our neighbor in that particular instance. In both cases, whether it's the not getting offended or not offending, we're doing the guarding of our conscience with respect to our neighbor. And so we do those in as much as we can in the situations that are easiest for us, where it's like, okay, I can sacrifice myself this time. Even if we know in the bigger one we probably aren't really willing to, and we might have to go and confess that or whatever. But if we practice it in the times when we can do that, it will become so much easier to do it in the bigger things. That's the only way we're going to get to the point to do it in the bigger things, is if we're doing it and remembering. So don't say next time it happens, what does it matter if I do this little thing? Say, this little thing is going to make me capable of overcoming something bigger later. Of not taking offense or of not offending somebody else. It's going to make my relationships better with God and with the people around me, the people I love and care about the most, who I don't want to have these conflicts with. And take the opportunities in the small things because they matter, I guess is sort of what Avedorothius is saying.
So we're going up and down that ladder from the material things to one another, and I guess above all, in order to do the second two, is to guard our conscience towards our relationship with God. And I think oftentimes that's where we lack in the other two, because if we're thinking about God's presence, then we're going to think about that in our relationship with one another and our relationship towards material things. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah. Well, I knew this might happen because I've been doing this study with with another group. And I know how much time it can take to kind of get through these texts. In light of your weather, and we're already at, say, 45 minutes or so, probably we should stop there. If anyone has any really pressing questions they want to ask about the fear of God that maybe won't wait until the next time, feel free to ask, and we can kind of close with that as a bit of a primer for the next time. But hopefully you won't be too discouraged that we only do the one lesson tonight, but I think that might be easier.
And the good point is now they have the readings, and they know where to find the readings, so when we reconvene with Father Matthew in a couple of weeks, there'll be no excuses, right?
Yeah, that's right. And less homework for those of you that, did it the first time. So any other questions either on, or thoughts or comments on the conscience? Or some introductory, pressing question you have on the fear of God that you want to bring up, something to help focus the reading for next time.
It seems like everybody's good over here.
Okay, very good.
Well, Papa, again, we thank you for spending time with us. It means a lot to us, and not just to those present, of course, but those who are watching online or later on. And we need to be going back and reading Avedorothios. I can remember hearing that book in Greek in the monastery in North Carolina about 15 years ago, actually. And I wanted to go underneath the table. It made me feel really bad in a good way. So I'm glad that this book has been translated in English, though it's now hard to find. But thank God we have the internet. We can share that. So thank you for picking this topic. It's very beneficial for us. If we could just ask you, we would end with a brief prayer, and then we should call it a night.
Thank you, Father.
O Christ, the true light, who dost enlighten and sanctify every man that cometh into the world, let the light of thy countenance be shined upon us, that in it we may see the unapproachable light, and guide our steps in the performance of thy commandments. By the intercessions of thine all-immaculate Mother, of our Holy Father among the saints, Avedorothius, and of all the saints. Amen. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Papa. Carlita. Drive safe, everyone.